I'm delighted to be here. I'm particularly delighted and appreciative of the organizers of this meeting, including a session to provide an opportunity to focus on the role of cities in planetary health and global health for an audience of this importance and a meeting of this importance. So one of the first questions that arises, am I doing this right here? There you go. Yeah, one of the first questions that arises is why cities? And one of the focuses that really since the year 2007, that exact year is contentious, but the facts are not contentious. The majority of the world's population have lived in cities, and the trajectory is continuing, projected by 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in cities. This is an issue that really changes the way we need to think about influences on our environment. The global reality, I think the attention has been expanded because it's a global issue. For many years, it was felt to be an issue of high-income countries and therefore not worthy of attention really at the global level. And as you can see from this diagram, the orange line represents the trajectory of urbanization in low and middle income countries, the high income country trajectory being fairly stable. The pace and scale is higher in low and middle income countries, and this is largely not because of the great growth in megacities, but in the growth in cities, so-called now sometimes secondary cities, of 250 to 500,000 people. So there is an opportunity not only to deal with future growth of the larger megalopolises and potentially retrofitting, but positive management of urbanization in these smaller growing cities. Another reason to focus on cities is they really dominate the world resource use. While they're economic engines of the globe and really drive culture and the arts and innovation in a given society, many times because they're linked to global communication and trade activities, they also consume the majority of energy and issue the majority of waste and greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the really important ways in which we need to shape the conditions for life and to achieve our global health goals is to focus on the role of cities in addressing these challenges. Another reason that cities have become interesting is they like to get things done. This is a set of what is a very long list of global associations of mayors focusing on everything from healthy aging to climate change to air pollution. And mayors, those of you that have been in a city government as I have, mayors, your constituents are in your face, you know? You've got to get things done. If you say you're going to do something and you go out and they don't know what you're talking about, you have a problem. It's a bit different from working at national, regional level. It's much more challenging, obviously, than at global level as well. So it's an exciting area to work, and I think many companies and many other constituents are finding them interesting. Mayors groups are rising when nations don't sign COP21, groups of mayors sign and get the politics organized. So with this, the other factor that's really making people focus on cities is with the increasing evidence of what is really critical conditions for health, realizing that health care is only one, actually quite small factor that determines the health status of populations. We are increasingly aware and have an evidence base the fact that decisions made in every sector are in fact affecting health. Decisions can be made for health or negative to health in all sectors like transportation, urban planning, housing, and others. And you're going to hear examples of these from my colleagues on the panel as we go forward. And to achieve this kind of multi-sectoral approach, again, thinking across agencies and cities or with constituents, with political leadership, aligning the interests of these stakeholders, an approach that's become pretty familiar with those in the health professions is called a health in all policies approach. It was really created by the Finns about 35 years ago. They first published a book about it, and it gets rediscovered periodically, but I think it's a really interesting governance framework for thinking about the importance of health as a benefit, not simply a cost center for the healthcare system. And the top areas I wanted to emphasize really is the health and well-being of all citizens is fundamental for economic and social development of any country. All government policies can have a positive or negative impact. We have an evidence base to inform those decisions. And obviously these impacts are not equitably distributed across the population, and people involved in urban health are very aware of the issue of health disparities. It's fundamental to their research approach. This is a more traditional model of how the health sector has been thinking about health, largely focusing on what I would call the medical model. A lot of the dominant themes in global health are universal coverage, strengthening health systems, health workforce, essential medicines. These are all really important areas, but increasingly looking at the broader determinants of health, we need to add to that set of interventions issues like the opportunities for urban planning, transportation, housing, and broader socioeconomic interventions to go along with the more clinically driven focus that we've had in the past. So our global framework, the SDGs, really supports this effort, and some people are really looking at the interdependencies around the SDGs. Goal 3 is health. It's still a bit of a stovepipe. Goal 11 is urban, for the first time a recognition of the importance of urban settlements. And I would say goal 17 is another important area you're going to hear about, which is the need for partnership, especially public-private partnerships in advancing change. And as we think about leaving no country behind and no individual behind, the issue of health equity is very important, and obviously the health of cities crucial. So this is a little focus on SDG 11. If you think about the bubble diagram I showed you earlier and you look at these headings, you'll see issues like transportation, urban planning, waste disposal. We see them as determinants of health in the broader sense. If we think beyond healthcare, you will not find the word health in SDG 11 or in the New Urban Agenda of Habitat, and you don't find urban in the Health Agenda Goal 3, but we're trying to bring those together to raise awareness about the fact that health is not only healthcare, that broad determinants of health require multi-sectoral collaboration and interdisciplinary scholarship, and obviously political leadership. And let me just end with a big of a plug for a meeting for the International Society for Urban Health being held in Xiamen, China. We hope you might join us to explore the opportunities for urban health and health equity going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to ask, we're going to keep, I want active dialogue, so we're going to go through our speeches, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. And our next, okay, I guess it'll be Anna talking next. Our next speaker is Anna Dyson. She's from Yale, one of my old places, a professor of architecture and forestry at Yale, and she's the director of the Yale Center for Ecosystems in Architecture. This is an incredibly unique collaborative effort around the university. It actually involves the schools of architecture, forestry and environmental studies, engineering, nursing, medicine, and public health. Anna, do you want to come and tell us how you bring all those disciplines together to work on the problem?
Okay, thank you so much. That makes sense. So with a very short period of time, first of all, it's an honor, and thank you so much, Michelle. To have a design architect as part of this discussion is sometimes rare, and so it's really an honor. I'm just going to touch on how human health and well-being has really changed the way that we are questioning values in the built environment, and in particular, I'm going to talk about in the context of rapid urbanization, what has historically been our relationship to non-human living systems, and how reevaluating possible questions like, can cities be net producers of biodiversity? Clearly, you can see here that we have evolved our built environment to really keep out non-human living systems. Sometimes we invite dogs and other pets inside, but really we have our parasites and we have our humans. And the disparity between that is really starting to bear down on emerging evidence that not only are we, is it highly detrimental in terms of all sorts of a range of effects, but it's highly detrimental to our human health and well-being. Also, in the question about where we live, we increasingly do live in cities, it's true, but we also increasingly live indoors. And just, for example, an indication of air quality. Air quality is typically between 2 and 5 times more problematic in terms of toxicity or a poor air quality than exterior airstreams. And that's a little known fact to public who are sort of conditioned to believe that they're safe from exterior pollutants by closing windows and cutting themselves off from extended ecosystems. And I'm just using our natural habitat here in New York City as a sort of a really extreme example of how we've kept non-human living systems out. And the question of what are the opportunities, really in highly developed cities already in 2050, over 85% of the built environment that's going to be existing in 2050 has already been built. So the question of retrofit is an extremely important question for us. And as Joe mentioned, the possibility for emerging economies to really build very, very differently. We call it, use a lot of layperson's terms in my field, we call it leapfrogging over the dumb 20th century infrastructure that we saddled ourselves with that doesn't convene really, is not convenient for either the extended ecosystem or ourselves. But then the question is, how do we invite other living systems to cohabit with us, and how do we actually transform our cities? There are emerging and encouraging developments of design whereby we really consider the requirements of living ecosystems simultaneously to our own and extended ecosystems, and also thinking about land use patterns. Could we, for example, grow our food, purify our water, purify our air through plant-based processes that are very much integrated into the surface areas and conditions that we have? These considerations of how we organize with other living systems really kind of relates to all of the ways we organize as material societies, the way we procure water, the way we metabolize energy, et cetera, in the built environment. And of course, if we go all the way down to the human, as I mentioned, increasingly we're looking at health and well-being as a value that we can bring into the system to measure how are we doing, what literally is that exchange that we have with our built environment, what we've produced, for example, on the left-hand side, and what we really, what we're basically absorbing and consuming on the right. If we just look at that condition of air quality, it also turns into a major social justice issue. The ex-urban air is increasingly depleted and becomes more and more toxic, but in a way that is spatialized by the built environment in an extremely unequitable way. So for example, in this image, you will just see, even in one urban air canyon between two buildings, one side could be, the leeward side could be 4 times as polluted as the windward side. So we're really getting into a situation of we're forming the built environment and we're designing, but how do we take into account what people need within those conditions? So if we look at the indoor, how do we actually also cohabit? Increasingly, we are seeing not just what biodiversity is, the lack of biodiversity within the built environment is doing for extended ecosystems, but there's many emerging and very compelling studies, such as Hanski et al. In Finland, who we are very inspired by this group because they've actually discovered and revealed that human health and immunity could be correlated with the absence or presence of rare flowering plants. So it's not about introducing any old green to our built environments and our indoor environments. It's about what kind of species and how do we actually create biodiversity. This is a quick image of the interior of the the Public Safety Answering Center in New York City, which has as a programmatic requirement to cut off the exterior air intake in case of any type of event on the outside, a Fukushima, 9/11, bioterror attack, whatever. Most secure buildings have this requirement, but the mechanical systems, it brings us to almost a poignant, and I agree with the introductory speakers who are talking about this also as a spiritual crisis, because basically this building would only allow for human life to persist for up to 10 days in case of an emergency. So we use these kinds of extreme clashes or dissonances, if you will, of sort of this era of the Anthropocene to leverage this building as a research site. So basically, we're asking the question, look, you can see the bunker building in the Bronx here and some scientists gathering around. A fun fact about this building is you can see some cuttings on the floor. The building inhabitants, they have a very stressful job. They're obviously emergency call answerers, and so they love this wall, and every time we shave the cuttings, they collect them immediately off the ground and bring them all over the building and put them in water to grow the plants. So literally this wall is spreading like around the building. And basically we use it as a research site which can look at that relationship between sort of extended different types of species, plant systems, soil-based systems, the biochemical relationships across different things, with human health and well-being in the built environment and how we shape that. And ultimately, this is a vast multi-scalar relationship. I started the slide with looking at, the sort of geological scale at which we're changing our cities, but it goes all the way down, obviously, to the molecular, to the microbiome. So one of the many things that we, in our sort of interdisciplinary alliances, will study is what is that interrelationship, for example, between the human microbiome and the microbiome of the built environment, which could be shaped by many aspects, obviously the occupants themselves, but surrounding environments and the architectural design of the space. Just as a kind of closing, I'll look at sort of also the scale at which we transform the cities through building types. This is a hospital, the Sheikh Khalifa Medical Center, where we're really pushing that, opening up that boundary between interior and exterior so that patients can come outside comfortably in a sort of environment that is, and this consideration goes all the way down to the housing scale. So basically, if you look at a satellite from the image, we could read many different aspects into that, that satellite image that I started with. What we often look at is literally what is the quote-unquote DNA of the built environment? How are we organizing? And ultimately, at the scale of the housing module, or literally what does a human being need to exist? This is an example of our collaboration with United Nations Environment and Habitat to see how, and we'll have these ecological modules spread around the world to exchange data and share information about that relationship between ecosystems and human health and well-being at that smallest scale. So we use the scale of migratory housing, which is really 195 square feet for a family of 4. It's very, very small. But the question is, what are those interrelationships between energy, water, food, air quality, processing, et cetera, and what can we do in that built environment to organize that? So, that relationship between, once again, daylighting, solar energy, clean and safe water, plant-based air purification with food-growing plants, on-site microfarming. We sort of measure in different climate types all over the world, what is it that you could do, and literally, in a sense, using the human being as the measurement, the sort of biomonitoring of the measurement. And of course, probably our most sort of precious and sensitive measurements are with the first 1,000 days of conception in maternal fetal care. So we're working with the UN and other partners on these kinds of units where we look at that interrelationship. Thank you.
Olga Sarmiento is a professor at the School of Medicine at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and is a board member of the Urban Health Network for Latin America and the Caribbean. Her work focuses on urban health and how community interventions impact the environment as well as promote healthy behaviors. Go for it.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Joe, for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. So today, I'm going to bring a little bit of the perspective of Latin America and some of the evidence that we have on transportation and health. So a little bit of the context of Latin America. We are a very highly urbanized region, one of the most unequal regions in the world. 23.5% of the population live in informal settlement, and we are the most violent region also in the world. Now, 5 cities of the 20 most congested cities are also in this region. And lastly, we also have a lot of problems with air pollution. 35% of the cities exceed WHO guidelines for PM2.5, and more than 50% of the population in a region live in these cities. So despite this chaos that we see in our region and that some of us have learned how to embrace, we also have innovative transportation policies and programs that sometimes go beyond the traditional system. So today I'm going to present you two of those programs. One is the Ciclovías Recreativas. You call it here in the US the Open Streets program. And the other one is the cable cars that have been integrated with mass transit. These two programs are very much aligned with the urban health agenda, specifically with SDG 11 and SDG 3, and also are very aligned within the framework of planetary health. So I will start with the Ciclovia program. Here in this picture, you see the one street that is very congested, that's in my city, Bogota, and you see the same street with individuals. So in this program, what we do is we close the streets for the vehicles and we open those streets for individuals for leisure activities. So a little bit of context of this program worldwide. We have documented almost 500 programs in the world in 26 countries. Most of them, as you see in this map, are concentrated in the Americas, but later, in the last year, we saw an increment of those programs in India, for instance, and we see that an inflection point on the graph, and that shows that those programs have increased since this century. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of information of my program, which is what we have been evaluating in the city of Bogota. So this program was inaugurated back in the 1970s. It's a multi-sectorial program, like you see in this network analysis that we conducted, where we have as the central node the sports and recreation out of the health sector, but we also have other 9 sectors that are very important for this network. Currently, we close 121 kilometers. In miles, it's about 70 miles. We have 71 events per year. We have all the Sundays of the 52 weeks, and all the holidays that we have in Colombia. So Colombia is actually the country with more holidays in the world, with India. And in terms of participants, we have estimated that we have per event from 600,000 individuals to 1.4 million. The funding comes from public funds. It's about 1.2 million per year, so it's less than $1 per person. So we have evaluated some healthy behaviors. This is a graph that shows our evaluation on physical activity among children. We found that children who are Ciclovia users have higher minutes of moderate to physical activity, and you see that in this graph. But more importantly, they have less sedentary time, so less time in front of the screen. What about air pollution? We also have evaluated some street segments of the Bogota Ciclovia, and we have found that air pollution levels are 13 times greater, and noise levels are 7 times greater on normal days when we compare those days with the Ciclovia days. And of course, we are replacing more than 3,000 vehicles by more than 3,000 bicycles, pedestrians, and individuals who are doing leisure activities. So now I'm going to move to the other program. This is the cable car. The cable cars that were integrated with mass transit. This is a picture of the new cable car in my city, Bogota. And in the other picture, you see the evolution of transport in this vulnerable area where we have a lot of informal settlements, from the donkey back in the 80s to the cable car last year. So a little bit of context. Worldwide, we have documented 24 cities worldwide that have this type of transport system, most in Latin America, but we also have it in Asia and in Africa. The increment was in the year 2004, when for the first time in Medellin, in Colombia, this was implemented and linked with the mass transit. So a little bit of information of Transmicali, the evaluation that we are conducting in our Salurbal study funded by the Wellcome Trust. So this cable was inaugurated last year. It has a length of 3.43 kilometers. We have 21,000 passengers per day. And look at the reduced time. It goes from 62 minutes to 13 minutes for this population. But more importantly, it really has an urban development around this cable. So we have 16 urban projects that are like park renovation, libraries, administrative office, terms, everything embedded in the concept of social urbanism. So we are evaluating this cable car through a natural experiment. We have an intervention group, a control group. We already finished baseline collection, and last year it was inaugurated, the cable car. And here I have a little bit of information of the characteristics of the population. So this is a non-car dependent population. More than 80% of the population use public transit. 6% have a car. It takes a lot of time for trips. It's 1 hour and 50 minutes, the average time. Most of the individuals meet physical activity recommendations, but in the transport dimension, not on the leisure dimension. And those who use the public transit are more likely to meet recommendations compared to those who use the informal or the vehicle mode of transport. Now, in terms of health-related quality of life, we find that the mean score, especially in the environmental dimension, is very low, and the item that they are more unsatisfied with is the item of transport. So in terms of pollution, in this graph, you see what we have been evaluated with personal monitors in our microenvironments. We have black carbon and PM2.5. Here to provide some context, we always see that developing countries have higher levels of pollutants compared to developing countries. And here you see the BRT feeder, which is what is likely to change by the cable car, and it has high levels of PM2.5 and black carbon. So we estimated the inhaled dose, and here's an example of just one trip, the one that is most likely to be changed by Transmicable. And what we estimated is that the contribution of a typical round trip in the feeder, which is what is likely to change by the Transmicable, to the daily inhaled dose, is estimated to be 8% for PM2.5, 10% for black carbon, and 20% for carbon monoxide. So what are the lessons that we have learned from these two out of the health sector programs that I just presented? First of all, they have the potential to impact the well-being of the individuals, but also their urban settings where these individuals live. These also show that are more practice-based. That practice-based evidence sometimes accelerates faster than evidence-based practice. I show you the graphs where you see an increment of those programs with so little evaluation. And we have, as researchers, the opportunity to use those windows of opportunity to really evaluate these programs. In terms of factors associated with sustainability, because we have a history of more than 40 years for one program, more than 10 years for other programs, there have been basically the interrelationship between the government, the political will, but the community appropriation is really what it gives them the sustainability, always within the multi-sectoral partnerships. And lastly, from the research part, we have learned that we really need to use mixed methods to evaluate these programs. It's so important to have our natural experiments, but we're using also citizen science, and we are involving our policy actors from the design through the evaluation of the programs. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Our next speaker is John Rossant. And John is the founder and chairman of the New Cities Foundation, a global nonprofit institution dedicated to improving the quality of life in cities. He's also the CEO of CoMotion, the leading global event and media platform on the future of urban mobility. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. It's always great to be back at Stanford, and I want to commend the Planetary Health Alliance for pulling this together. It's a very important initiative. I want to talk a little bit about, I guess I should do this. No? There we go. About the New Cities Foundation, which was founded around 12 years ago. We look at the future of cities around the world. And within that, we look very closely at the impact of new technologies on city building. Our mission is to make cities more livable, to improve the quality of life and work in cities. And typically we link private sector and public sector. It's often a somewhat uneasy conversation. We try to facilitate that. About 7 years ago, we had a little bit of a eureka moment at the New Cities Foundation. And Google, a local company just down the road, became a member of the New Cities Foundation because they were beginning to ramp up the core investments in autonomous vehicle technology, which would later become Waymo, which is one of the big autonomous vehicle concerns in the world. And they wanted to understand how autonomous vehicles would operate in an urban context. So, and they felt that we could help them a little bit. And so we began to look at that. And I remember I was in New York at the time, and the week that Google joined our foundation, during that week, 3 people came up to me separately and said, "Have you heard about this great app called Uber? You just sort of press it and a black car arrives and it's cheaper than a taxi. It's like having your own chauffeur." And I remember just, we kind of gathered together at the foundation. We thought, this is going to be huge. This is, represents what we felt instinctively back then, and I think is absolutely the case now, nothing less than a mobility revolution, a drastic sort of top to bottom disruption in how people and goods move around, and how people and goods in particular move around cities. And when you think about it, if you look at urban mobility, nothing has really changed for over 100 years since Henry Ford and others came out with mass-produced internal combustion engine cars that became all the rage everywhere. And our cities have been designed around the internal combustion engine vehicle. That is beginning to change dramatically. And I would suggest, and I would maintain, that the disruption that is beginning to take place in urban mobility with the arrival of electric mobility at scale, autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles of every type, micro-mobility. Tomorrow, for example, or let's say the day after tomorrow, urban air mobility at scale. So this afternoon when I go to San Francisco, instead of taking the BART or a Lyft or a car, I will simply summon a electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, and it will take me to central San Francisco in probably 5 or 6 minutes. And that is coming much sooner than you think, by the way. So it's a very, very interesting and important revolution. And why? And I think it will have more of an impact on health and well-being than almost any other thing. Because if you, it's been said, we're all destined to live in cities, most of us. If you look at the typical North American city, it's concrete, it's asphalt, it's parking lots. Roads and freeways and parking lots account for sometimes as much as 2/3 of the space in the city. I currently live in Los Angeles. The amount of surface parking lots just in the city of Los Angeles is twice the size of Manhattan. We are prisoners of this system, but we're beginning to break out of the prison, which is going to be, I think, very, very important for the planet. And what is interesting also about mobility is that we think that it represents, in some ways, the third stage of the internet revolution. It's the extension of the internet to moving things, to physicality. Every moving thing will be networked. If you think about it, the innovation of Uber and Lyft, of Bird microscooters, et cetera, it depends on very robust internet networks, and that will, I think, only continue. What we're looking at now that I think is very, very interesting is the relationship between a lot of these new mobility operators, like Uber or Lyft, or tomorrow an operator of a electric vertical takeoff and landing taxi, and cities and municipal governments. Because the traditional model has been that cities have been largely very passive. So they have ownership of an incredibly important asset, which is the physical right of way. But they haven't acted as real concerned property owners in the sense that an Uber or a Lyft have come and essentially dictated the rules for the rollout of those new kinds of services. The same with, for example, Bird or other kinds of micromobility, connected micromobility devices that have gone from nowhere in the last 2 years to nearly every major city in the world has them. Cities now, in a sense, are fighting back. And they realize that they have to exert much more control over not only the physical right-of-way, but also the digital right-of-way. And that's leading to very, very interesting conversations between mobility operators, new mobility operators, and cities. And we think that this will certainly, this interplay between public and private will be very, very key in the future health, the future livability in cities. And that's why we support a much increased public and private cooperation. It's absolutely necessary. And I think we see much more of that. For example, in Los Angeles, which has been the city where micromobility was really launched, it's I think probably the biggest single market for Uber. The city now has said, if you want to operate on our streets, in our digital, in our right-of-way, et cetera, you must share data with us so that we can, that allows us to make, to plan long terms, et cetera. It's a big battle. Uber has been fighting back, et cetera. But we think that ultimately there will be some very, very good kinds of cooperation. Thank you.
Our last speaker is David Vlahov, who's the Associate Dean of Research at Yale School of Nursing and editor of the Journal of Urban Health. Thank you for your copy. He's the founding president of the International Society for Urban Health.
Great, thanks.
David, forward, the green one, big grid.
Okay.
And there's your timer.
Very good. I see it down here, and I'm talking fast. I want to recognize just two people in the audience very quick. Jason Corburn, who has really been a tutor for me, and Ann Kurth, who has really been encouragement and support for me all along here. So what I'm going to be talking about is the fact that when we think about urban health, we should be thinking about not just the growth into cities, into urban overall, but the fact that a large proportion of that is going to be going into urban slums. There was 1 billion people estimated in 2007, 2008, and some of the earlier estimates is within decades it would be 2 billion. Some of these estimates have been modified since then, but what is it that's bringing people into cities? And it's the push-pull factor. On this slide, you'll see some push factors on the left. I want to emphasize that there are climate factors, such as droughts, but there are also wars that go on, draw people into cities. The pull factors, I think, are very important in that the opportunities, cities are places where you generate wealth, and it's through opportunity. So again, this is what brings people into cities. When you have people moving into cities, you are seeing expansion spatially. And this is Mexico City, 1910 is the yellow in the middle, and for each decade it is expanding outward. This has a number of environmental concerns as well as the infrastructure challenges that have been talked about in the previous slide. So how to respond to this? Some of the governments have looked at this as an embarrassment. And so, bulldozing some of the settlements, and then they appear the next day or within a few days. Is it that you can move people back to rural areas? Can you make them sufficiently attractive? I think some of the challenges are really too big to be able to do that quickly. Can we look at some of the smaller secondary cities, and we're able, in that case, to project growth and to plan rather than retrofit? But again, what we're seeing with Zipfer's law is that the large cities are going to continue to get large. Mega cities are not going to go away. They're going to increase in size, and they're going to be more of them. So the question is, how is it that we deal with that? Well, we've got a number of challenges as people are coming in, and the housing that they find is in undesirable areas related to their poverty. There's climate risk. I think we're all familiar, the adverse weather, rising sea levels, and then also thinking about the slum heat island. This is not just downtown Manhattan that we're talking about. So again, there are a number of challenges. There are health consequences in terms of looking at slums. We used to look at data as urban-rural comparisons, and rural health indicators were worse than they were in urban. And so a lot of resources were going out into rural areas. There became disaggregation of data, and when you started to look at urban slums, you'll see in this slide in 2000 that rates in this case of under 5 mortality, and we could give a lot more examples, were higher in slums than we saw in rural areas. You see in 2012 that you have better outcomes, but the relationship persists. In terms of informal settlements, let's look at upgrading. There are a number of actions to achieve that are listed here. I think some of the most important are the land security and tenure and housing, which can also have to have these other services as well. So what are some of the approaches to improving the quality of life of slum dwellers? There are a number of approaches. One, relocation to alternative sites, and that second is in situ redevelopment, which I'll mention very quickly, and then in situ upgrading. So one example of the development is bringing in public-private partnerships, and in doing that, how is it that you get developers involved in order to address the issue of slums? And the way the government has done it in one particular city, and more than that, is to be able to sell land at less than fair market value, and then also to increase regulation so that there's increased floor space index. And what that really means is going vertical. And so some of the work that's happened here is you see increasing housing that is becoming vertical for residents of the slums, that is in proximity into the same land as what are built as luxury apartments, because the developers need to be able to get profit, basically, from the work that they've been doing. What this does is two things. One is it raises concerns about the quality of the housing that is happening in the rehabilitation. Are we taking shortcuts? And does that mean that we are developing vertical slums? The second part of that is you're pricing out the middle class, and I think some people here can relate to that. In situ upgrading is a little bit different here in that we're looking at not just physical, but social, economic, organizational, and environmental improvements all pulled into one package together. And it's undertaken cooperatively, locally, among the citizens. The citizens are the active drivers in partnership with the community groups, businesses, local authorities. An example here is the Mangkong project in Thailand. And again, that means housing security, some really dramatic developments in terms of investment into communities, and the residents really leading in terms of the improvements, and you can see some of the change. Another is the Asian Coalition for Community Action. Again, this is broader in terms of 250 Asian cities. It's small scale for small scale infrastructure, loans to communities, technical assistance, and again, it's not just looking at the slums, but a citywide approach, leveraging funds from other sources. So you're looking towards inclusion, not just of working to upgrade slums, but incorporate into the city. So the role of government is to recognize and put the residents as central actors and change the perspective of settlements as special cases and incorporate into a comprehensive urban plan. Newer views are really looking at, can slums actually inspire cities of the future? You have the density, the proximity, the association, you've got the mixed use, you've got compact footprint, any number of things. Are there creative ideas not only to improve conditions currently in slums, but really to be an inspiration and proving ground for what we do elsewhere? Thank you.
So you can see on this panel, we try to balance public and private sector perspectives, the north and south perspective, and importantly for me, it's not a manel. So I'm going to actually ask the audience now to participate in some questions. Kathy, do we have, okay, Olivia, okay. So if you have a question, and while you're waiting for a question, I'm gonna pose one to Joe Ivey. Joe, you've been a pioneer in urban health and bringing attention to this. Can you talk to us about what the challenges are for bringing attention urban health and planetary health? Here, sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we've been, at the International Society, been focusing on trying to keep the words urban and health together. So I think the challenges are that when you think about health, people automatically think about personal health care. And so the clarity of language is really important in the conversation, because if you can clearly make that distinction, then healthcare becomes an element in a broader set of determinants that include many of the other factors that are really critical in planetary health, like environment, like planning, like the things we've heard about from our colleagues. I think the other really difficult thing is that bringing things together in urban, and I think it's something I think that people are poking at in the planetary health world. It's really about interdisciplinary scholarship, which is very challenging in many universities. We're very used to having everyone with their discipline and having them learn the same language and begin to collaborate and get financial incentives aligned is a challenge in the educational space to get the evidence base that we need. And similarly, as my colleagues have talked about, the question of action being multisectoral. It can't happen in one place. It can't be only government. It also can't be only one particular agency. So these are challenges, I think, in the historic patterns we've used, in historic ways we've developed evidence and mobilized for action. So the last thing I'd say is political leadership comes to the forefront. We talk much more about governance when we're talking about urban health and political leadership than perhaps we have previously in other more traditional models.
So questions, because certainly we're going to need governance to achieve planetary health as well. Questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Hi, Allison Carlson for Scythia Foundation. My question is for Dr. Dyson. Thank you for your talk. I'm curious, you addressed the air filtration systems and treatment for indoor air pollution, but not prevention of a large portion of it that comes from toxic building materials. I'm curious, do you think that I'm over-crediting toxic building materials?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. Actually, in our view, shifting the base materials towards what we call biocompatible material life cycles, which means like everything that goes into it, energy, toxicity, et cetera, is one of the most important and sort of highest priorities for transitioning the built environment. So that's an excellent question. Thank you. There are signs of hope that increasingly we have sort of optional point systems like LEEDs and like leadership in energy and environmental design, or other pearls is in the Middle East, that will mandate the requirement for materials to be specified in a certain way, and for example, low VOCs or no VOCs materials, et cetera. But so I do think that there is hope on the horizon, and we can see a transition. Unfortunately, a lot of these materials today tend to come with a higher price tag, or, and they tend to be confined to what we would call trophy buildings. So I think what's really important that David really mentioned, I think Jo in her introduction, is our opportunities are with, underdeveloped or undeveloped cities where we can really start from scratch with what we're doing. So what we look at also is how can you get biocompatible materials, for example, from post-agricultural waste cycles or other things where the treatment and the materials would be completely different.
Next question.
Pats?
Can we pass it? Yeah, Jonathan.
Jonathan Pats from the University of Wisconsin. It's argued that within the next 50 years, more people will live in cities that haven't even been built yet, that compared to people living in cities now. What are some of the key steps to ensure that as new cities and new neighborhoods are built, that they're done for health in the first place?
David or John, do you want to take that?
I'm on, okay. That's a really good question. One of the interesting phenomena that we're seeing around the world is precisely because of this tsunami of populations moving to urban areas, that societies and states are having to build greenfield cities from scratch, essentially. What's so interesting about that is that because of the technological revolution in the built environment that you were talking about, because of the revolution in mobility, et cetera, we can now begin to incorporate many of these best practices and technologies in large greenfield cities development. So to give you one example, we're actually working very, very closely with an extremely large greenfield city, a new planned city in the Middle East. It's one of the most ambitious in the world. It is being planned now as a post-car city. The planners are saying we will not have any privately owned internal combustion engines. So that kind of gives you an example of hopefully what the future will hold.
David, can you also address, because many of these new cities are peri-cities, peri-urban areas, and become micro-cities themselves. So you want to address that and build on Jonathan's question?
I think there are a couple of points. If you look at the what was called the China Dream, where we're going to build 200 cities in 20 years, some of the development that's happened there is you're seeing cities that are being built without people in them. And so one has to really think about the last point that I was bringing up, which is not just insight to upgrading, but in development and the importance of bringing together the people who are going to be residents with the community development and all the other partners, and putting the residents to be at the center of the planning process, and certainly through the implementation. Some of the work that I've seen that's interesting, although more to be developed, is this concept of the micro-city, where you're looking at economic development zones, but are also social development zones as well, of about 100,000 people that, again, are developing a sense of a micro-city, and then eventually to be connected with other micro-cities. So again, it's not organic growth, but it is progressive growth, if I can put it that way.
So we can take one last question because we're a little bit behind. Go ahead.
My name is Federico Andrade. I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. My alma mater is Universidad de los Andes, so it's very nice to see Olga here. This question could be to anyone, but I just want to talk about something that Professor Olga Sarmiento mentioned, that is citizens' science. And for example, in Bogota, there is a strong movement of people measuring air quality inside the buses, and there's been like some conversations with institutions that they're not always go like in the best way. And I want to ask about the role of academics and researchers on improving this conversation between citizens that are concerned about the city but are not always heard by institutions, and if you have like an experience that you want to share. Thank you.
Okay, so regarding citizen science, we're using the model of citizen science by the people with technology, actually. So our citizen scientists, our community members, they are using photo voice with this app, and they are recording the perceptions within the transport system, within the neighborhood system, and then we analyze the data with them, and then we meet with our policymakers, and we use their voice. So in the case of the cable car, initially for baseline, they were using their voice, and they were, actually, many of them were very accepting of how that will be a good implementation for their area. Now, after the implementation and in the follow-up that we're doing, we're interviewing them again, and we are meeting again with policy actors. And basically what we're using is their voice to really present the perceptions of what they feel are good and things that they may want to change. And we have found that that's a very, very important voice. And we also have found that it's a way also to make our research more democratic. So we're using it in that way.
So I'd like to thank our panelists. Oh, David, did you want to say something?
The issue of data is so important, and certainly from the perspective of the residents. If you're looking at slums, for example, if they're not recognized, then you don't have a census to be able to have influence in a political sphere. And if you can't vote because you don't have an address, again, I think these basic issues that are important to be able to arise for that population in that setting. Certainly also mapping what the amenities are as well as what the dangers are. And so that, I think, leads in an important way towards development and also ownership and citizenship that is so important for economic and other development. Thank you.
So on that ending of advocacy and empowerment, I hope we all go out and do it. Thank you very much, and thanks to the panelists.